Welcome to another episode of I Catch Killers. Today we're going to delve deep into the world of drugs. Illegal drugs have impacted on most of us in some way, but do we really understand what is going on in the so-called war on drugs? I'm going to be speaking to a BBC reporter and filmmaker, Conor Woodman, who has done an exceptional job of investigating the drug trade in Australia. He's the author of the book called Meth Road, which takes a fascinating look at all aspects of the drug trade in Australia, in particular the use of methamphetamine. We're going to talk about the manufacture, the supply, law enforcement, health issues and harm reduction. In addition to that, we're going to talk about Conor's extraordinary undercover investigation which took him deep into the jungles of Myanmar. Looking forward to this one. Conor Woodman, welcome to I Catch Killers.
Thanks for having me. Really good to be here.
Well, look, I know you're a busy man, so I appreciate you giving the time, but I've just finished your book, Meth Road. And I got to say, it was a fascinating read. And I was a cop for 30 years, so I sort of had a pretty good understanding of the drug trade and the drug world. But you opened my eyes up to quite a few things about methamphetamines and the drug trade in Australia.
Oh, good. Okay. And I guess I say a few controversial things about the police, so I was a little bit worried about this one.
Well, you
I
know,
wondered if I was going to cop it from you. I
no,
mean, I totally take the I'm sort of prepared for the criticism that, I'm not Australian. I don't live in Australia. So there's plenty of people that might say, why don't you look in your own backyard and, write a book about, I don't know, cocaine in London, or which, maybe I will. But I kind of, on the other hand, came with a pair of fresh eyes, I felt, and was able to look at things anew a little bit.
I
Which
think I think that came across in your book, and it's good
good.
to have an objective viewpoint where you're not involved and you can look from the outside. But I got to say, in prepping for the podcast and a little bit of research I've done on you, you are a true investigative journalist in the yeah truest sense. You get in there and have a look around, don't you?
Yeah, no, I absolutely do. So, yeah, I've been in one form or another, whether writing books or making documentaries. I've based a good proportion of my career around crime and telling stories about criminals. And one of the things that I do like to do, as you say, is to get in there, boots on the ground, see what it's like for the inside, and put myself in the story, so that when I'm engaging with an audience, whether it's in a book or whether it's in a film, I'm able to say, look, I'm right here. I'm in the thick of it. This is what it feels like. This is what it sounds like. These are the real characters who are making up this world. So it's not just stats and numbers and figures. Criminal networks are made up of real people, and I like to try and tell their story.
Well, it certainly translated it in that translated in Meth Road, the book it came across. But I've got to say, you plan to infiltrate a drug cartel in Myanmar, as posing as an Australian drug dealer. I've seen better plans. The fact that you're still here, I think, is quite amazing. We're going to speak a little bit about that, but that must have been an experience for you.
Yeah, I'm not sure my Australian accent would pass muster with you, but it was okay with a couple of Burmese drug smugglers. I got away with it. Yeah, I mean, sometimes a bit of duplicity, I think, opens a door. You tell people what they want to hear, and then they open up, and those guys were in the business of smuggling meth out of Myanmar. We should clear up whether we're going to say Myanmar or Burma. I think Myanmar is probably what we have to say these days. A lot of people will know it from their old school geography books as Burma, but it's the same thing. So these guys were, operating from Myanmar and running methamphetamine out of the country into Laos. So one of the smuggling routes that I discovered when I was there was that the drugs would go across the Mekong River into Laos, and then we can get into where there are staging posts and different drug gangs taking over different legs of the journey. But that was their little part. Yeah. Their little part was, we'll get it over the border, we'll get it out of Myanmar for you, if you if you're a serious buyer. So I had to pose as a serious buyer, and I got introduced to them through a connection, and they came over for a meeting, and it was extraordinary how easy it was.
Yeah. And when we talk Myanmar, that's a country that's in turmoil. It's under military rule at the moment, and there's been conflict there for a long time, and there's rebel groups and the military taking over. So it's a dangerous place to infiltrate. It's a country where there's a lot of lawlessness in there and a lot of violence.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I've done stories from like war zones before, and I've been in some pretty hairy criminal situations as well. Myanmar was one of the most difficult places I've ever had to work because, as you say, the country's been riven by civil war for a couple of generations. Would you believe another place where British colonialism left a mess behind itself?
There we go again. That's another podcast. We'll do that one later.
Yeah. So, you've got a country where, the British left, the Japanese came in, Japanese went out, the Kuomintang, effectively the opposition to the Chinese Communist Party, got squeezed out, and various different ethnic armed groups in Myanmar took up arms and decided, well, we're not going to live under this kind of central government that is ethnically different to us. We want to be autonomous. And so, everyone's fighting everybody. And that's kind of part of the problem, is that you have a country in which at any one time, 3, 4, or 5 different ethnic armed groups will be fighting a civil war against the central government, which makes it the kind of place where the rule of law is quite difficult to uphold. So if you're in the business of producing tons and tons of Class A drugs for export, it's quite a good, it's a good cover. It's a good place for you to operate. And there are various different alliances and strategic alliances that people are making with each other in order to be able to operate without being sort of pulled up by the law.
It's certainly a good environment for that type of industry to flourish. I've had a previous war crimes investigator on the I Catch Killers podcast, and talking about all the horrific things he's seen and investigated, and he rated Myanmar as one of the most confronting and violent places in terms of war crimes that he's seen. So that sort of puts it into context, the area that you're going in. I'm familiar with the country as well. My son lived over there for 12 months, and he had some stories to tell with his travels around Myanmar and different things. So we'll get on to how you actually infiltrated in detail. Before we do, could we just find out a little bit about yourself? You were born in Ireland, raised in England. Take the story from there.
Yeah, still support the boys in green at the rugby, so let's be clear about that. Okay. But yeah, I've lived in the UK for a really long time. London is home, but originally I was from Ireland. And I went to school, went to university in the UK, and kind of accidentally found myself working in television. That's probably true of most people. Like, no, I don't think anyone does anyone think, oh, TV is the career I want to do? When they talk to their careers teacher as a teenager, probably not. It's something that kind of finds you, I think. And I found myself working in TV, and gradually just got drawn into doing the stuff that was a bit more investigative. I quickly realized I didn't want to be making sort of overproduced reality TV. I was always into economics and politics on a kind of global scale, and so I was interested in international stories and got drawn into telling stories about international crime, I think, originally, and doing a lot of sort of travel and adventure kind of stuff as well. And then I get, things kind of come together as you become a bit more experienced, and I realized I liked being out in dangerous environments. I'm kind of this. It's not really an adrenaline junkie thing. I think I find that when you're in those places where the rule of law is broken down, the stories of human survival that come out in those situations that operate outside of the law kind of fascinate me, and the people who operate, who have to kind of find another way outside of society, have always been interesting to me, and I've been drawn to those kind of stories. So, a lot of people have said to me, "Oh, how can you spend so much of your time, talking to criminals, and how do you get them to talk to you?" And I would say, "Well, I just ask them questions,
Yeah.
just go and meet them and ask them questions. Everyone likes talking about themselves. Everyone likes talking about work.
Say hello.
So,
Yeah.
yeah, you say hello and ask them what their job's like. Most people who are operating on the other side of the law don't get asked that question very often.
Yeah.
So yeah, it was something I've always been really drawn to it. And when I find a good story, especially something that involves maybe the other side of the law, the other side of the tracks, I'm doubly drawn to it.
Well, it's something that fascinates a large group of people. I think the true crime and looking at whether it's true crime or just interesting stories that are a little bit outside the norm of life, because life can become a bit tedious in the way that we're living life, and sometimes it's nice to look over the other side. But full credit to you. I think that's, to me, and I've only been working in journalism for 3 coming on to 4 years after a career in the police. But the journalists I look up to, like you have people that you look up to in the police going through a career, but the journalists I look up to are the ones that go out and find the stories. They're the ones that fascinate me, and they've always got the interesting stories. So full credit to you for doing that. Let's talk about methamphetamine now. Now, it's a pretty horrendous drug. What do you think separates that from other drugs? And when I talk other drugs, if we're talking cocaine, heroin, anything that the norm, cannabis, but methamphetamines seems to sit separate to those drugs.
Yeah, that's a really good question. And I'll preface this by saying methamphetamine is not something we have a big issue with in the UK. It's popular recreationally, I think, in the gay scene, for example, association with chemsex parties and stuff, but it's not something that you see much of around and about. So I was interested in why Australia, I guess New Zealand, some other parts of the region, there was a lot more methamphetamine use that was prevalent, which we can get onto from the supply side of things. Yeah. But I think from the demand side and like what makes methamphetamine so different, and maybe what draws so many people into using it, so I think there's 2 things to it. I think, first of all, it engenders this very disassociative state. It really takes people out of themselves, and it takes people out of their situations very effectively. In a weird way, in a way that the only thing I can really compare it to is alcohol, that gives it, you can function quite well on methamphetamine until it catches up with you, in the same way as you can kind of probably function on alcohol so it catches up with you. But it's very insidious insofar as how it stimulates the dopamine system and creates these sort of pathways of reinforcement. So I take methamphetamine and then I do something while I'm on methamphetamine and it feels good. So I want to keep doing that thing. And then I want to keep taking methamphetamine and I can function while I'm doing that. So time can pass very quickly. And one of the things that I was really shocked by when I started spending time around methamphetamine users, especially problematic methamphetamine users, was they could go days and days and days. And I think whereas, you go on a night out and take some ecstasy or even some cocaine, at some point your body's going to say, enough, I need to go to sleep.
Shut
It's self-limiting. Whereas methamphetamine doesn't seem to have that effect on habitual users. They can go for days and days and days. Yeah. So it is very different, I think, and quite destructive as a result of that.
And that you see it, and I know, like the research you've done in the book, that you see it, that separates it from the other type of drugs, the other illegal drugs, and that's a danger associated with methamphetamine, the addictive nature of it, and it gets hold of you before you realise.
Yeah, I mean, for example, there's a guy in the book that I interviewed, who's captain of industry. The guy was, I think he's a good example because he was a guy who'd never done drugs before. He was running a multi-million-dollar business. He was a pillar of the community, and he got into, the company that he was running was doing a big IT review. So they brought in a team of consultants who were going to review the whole IT systems. They were working late into the night, and then a very tight deadline. And one night he was up working with them, and he saw a pipe going around. He said, "What's that?" They said, "Oh, it's methamphetamine. You should give it a go. It really helps you kind of stay up late and work through the night." And he said, "Oh, no, never. I never do drugs. Never done drugs before." But he saw them use it, these IT guys using it, and he thought, "I'll go on and I'll give it a go."
Yeah.
And 6 months later, the guy's driving around with a gun in his car, and because he's a captain of industry and he's a businessman, he's trying to buy a kilo of it so he get a better price, and he gets stopped by the police and arrested, and he ends up in jail. Like, whoa,
Yeah.
how did that happen in such a short space of time? 6 months. That's the power of a drug like methamphetamine. It can take hold of you. It can become compulsive, addictive, and very quickly your life begins to unwind.
The story you say there, I've heard it, I've seen it. It brings me to mind past guests that we had on here, Simon Fennick, that was running a business, successful, life in order, who's a sportsman, had everything going for him. Tried it, and this is great. It's making me, I can do more at my business. I can sit up, I can do this, and it got hold of him. He lost his business, ended up in jail. Same story. So there is a real concern with the drug, and I think, that's why it's separated from other drugs. It's interesting how, I'll talk in Australia, but I know you made reference in your book, and it's referencing what I've seen. It seems to be socially acceptable to sit around and do a couple of lines of coke in a flash restaurant in the toilets or in the entertainment industry, and no one's going to judge you. But if you put your hand up and say, "Oh, let's do some meth," everyone sort of shies away. Is that just because of the insidious nature of the drug? What separates the public perception in your mind?
Yeah, I think there's a social stigmatization in Australia, especially. I mean, I had to learn what the word bogan meant when I started writing a book about methamphetamine. You're right, because it's fine to go to the pub and get, absolutely blotto. It's socially acceptable to do cocaine at a dinner party. Amongst groups of people who are doing those drugs, they are normalizing that behavior for each other. And so there's no stigma attached. But they all seem to look down their noses at methamphetamine users as, junkies, as bogan. And I think that's part of the problem, certainly in terms of stigmatization within society. I think there's a lack of empathy maybe amongst certain drug users for other drug users. And people who, I think there's a hypocrisy there in people who, drink booze or take cocaine to look at a methamphetamine user and think, well, they've got a problem and I don't. Not to say that you couldn't have, I mean, you could have a problem with any of those drugs, but even at a recreational level, I think someone who might do methamphetamine maybe 2 or 3 times a year still gets stigmatized in Australia because there's something about the drug that seems cheap, that seems undesirable.
I think we could break that down. There's nothing cool about someone taking meth. Yeah, you could sell it as, this person's all right if they're doing a line of coke, but someone that's doing meth is looked at as a dirt and not dissimilar to the way a heroin user was looked at. Just a heroin junkie. Yeah, that was the terminology we had here in Australia. I'm interested in the thought process. Why, when you're looking at drugs in Australia, in particular the impact of methamphetamine, why you decided to track back to the source? Like quite often when research is done about the impact of drugs in a country or in a community, they look at the community. What drove you to track the source back from where it came from?
Yeah, that's a good point. I mean, and you see so many Australian news stories will say, oh, half a ton of methamphetamine was caught at the border in Sydney. The drugs originated from Asia, or they came from Thailand, and that's it. That's the end of the story.
Yeah,
like there's no interrogation beyond that. And actually, for me, this story found me the other way around. So I was, over the years, I've made a lot of films, done a lot of stories in different parts of the world, and I keep in touch with journalists and producers and stringers working in different places. And an old colleague and friend of mine was doing a story for one of the networks, one of the streamers, They wanted to film inside a meth lab in Myanmar, and the story kind of imploded when one of their criminal informants that was helping them get access into this meth lab got himself shot.
Yeah.
And she called me in a blind panic one morning in a car racing back for the Thai border because the guy that she'd been going to meet had been shot. Meanwhile, the whole production team are saying, well, this story's too hot for us. We're pulling out. So they were like, well, no way we're going to send our production crew and our expensive presenter into somewhere where people are getting shot. She got out to Thailand, but the story fell apart. And I thought, oh, well, that seems like too good a story to give up. So I kind of picked up the strings there a little bit, packed my bags, flew off to Myanmar. So what's all this about meth labs in Myanmar? And so I started really at that end of the story.
Right.
I started with, well, okay, so you've got all this methamphetamine being created in Myanmar. I guess the next question is, well, why? Where's it all going? And, hitherto I thought that most of Australia's methamphetamine came from China. So it was only when I started joining the dots and realized, well, hang on, this is a road. This is a road that joins two countries that really have no great shared history, or great cultural interest in each other, and yet you've got $50 billion industry in a war-torn country in Southeast Asia that's fueling a massive social drug epidemic that's going on the other side of the region. That for me just became mind-blowing. But that's where I started. I started on the Myanmar side, and then kind of followed the route and ended up in Australia. And once I got into Australia, then I started asking questions about, well, why is it all coming here? The book is kind of divided, as you've seen, into supply and demand, because I think you can look at the two things quite separately and then see how they link together.
The book, to me, opened my eyes up to looking at it as holistically, because quite often you think, okay, this is the impact you see on the streets, this is the damage that's done on the streets. But looking at where the supply comes from and how it gets to our country, I'm fascinated, and I still, I'll say confused, but I have to accept it because you're not the only source, and the book's well researched. Is that Australia is the highest per capita user of methamphetamines in the world?
Yeah, I mean, there was. I guess it used to be the case, and you'll probably remember this back from your days in the police force. There used to be an awful lot of Australia's methamphetamine would have been produced within Australia.
Yeah,
and going back, there was a history back to the sort of 70s and 80s of Australians taking speed. So there was always a kind of appetite for amphetamines, and then that market got filled by the bikie gangs cooking out in the bush.
Yep.
We're into Breaking Bad territory there.
Yep.
But I think what happened was that the Australian government, the Australian Border Force, the AFP started to work out which chemicals were required to make all this stuff, and started to prohibit those. And you need 10 kilograms of chemicals or precursors to make 1 ton of meth. And the distributors within Australia worked out quite quickly, well, why take the risk of bringing in 10 tons of chemicals that we could get caught with, rather than just bring in 1 ton of meth? If we could just bring in the meth, it's a tenth of the risk.
It makes sense, doesn't it? Economical sense. And risk.
And then on top of that, you've got the Asian gangs. The big gang, Sam Kaur, who stepped into the market and really took control of the market, who offered the bikie gangs with a guarantee. Well, if we send you a shipment of 0.5 ton and it gets caught at the border, we'll just send you another one. The profit margins are so big that we'll just eat it. We'll send you another one. And it's like Amazon level guarantees.
Get one through, and you've made your profit for the year. Doesn't matter about the other two that have been seized.
Absolutely.
You've raised the. I want to take us through Myanmar, but you raised the drug labs, and I know that in that the time you were talking about, a good cook was valued by the bikies. If you had a cook in the early days that knew what they were doing, that was, let's get hold of them, and the money flowed from that. Then you got the person that you referred to in the book, Dale, that you had your little home labs, little clandestine labs that the cops, when we found one, it'd be on the news. We found shut down another lab. But Dale invented and tell me if I'm wrong here, but he invented a new way of manufacturing the drug, and it was called the box lab. Do you want to talk us through that?
A fascinating story. This guy from Queensland, Dale Francis Drake, no real formal education, but an interest in chemistry. The story goes that he had a dream, and in the dream, someone appeared to him and told him to try this new formula for cooking meth. And what it did was it transformed the mechanism that people were using before that, which was quite a big, complicated industrial, sort of semi-industrial process that needed quite sophisticated kit, and meant that you could cook meth instead on a similar level, similar scale, but using a lot less kit and easier to acquire chemicals. And Dale put all this together, and it worked. And suddenly Dale became like the guy. Like all the bikie gangs were sending people up to go and get an education from Dale, and Dale was charging the bikie gangs, like a sort of private university, showing people how to cook meth. And his method, the so-called box lab, because it would all the kit you needed would fit into a single box. His box lab started to pop up in the United States. The FBI were finding Dale's box labs in Oregon and California and Idaho, and like a truly international export from Australia.
Well, at last someone's finally giving Dale some credit. So shout out.
Yeah,
to
well,
Dale.
he was kind of poor old Dale really was sort of written off in the press at the time as being a sort of I think they called him a hillbilly Satanist, and he was sort of dragged through the press. Because the Australian press are not very kind, I think, to methamphetamine users.
Yeah.
And they're quite vilified in the press. And I think once Dale's story came out, it was interpreted. It was given a very particular slant by the papers at the time. Certainly, no one was celebrating the invention and his genius. Let's say.
Well, again, that is the stigma attached with the drugs, and the impact, and what gets reported is when someone's died, or there's been an incident that's drug related, and people gravitate towards that. You work in the media, you understand how it works.
Yeah, I think we've got a big responsibility maybe to kind of look at that. When I went to Australia and I saw that TV ad you had running for ages with the guy turns up at the ER room and he's in a meth psychosis.
Yeah, and attacks the police officers, and
he sort of turns into the Incredible Hulk and rips the ER room apart.
Yeah,
I mean, when I was shocked when I saw that TV spot. I was like, really? I mean, I don't think that's helping. I don't think it's convincing. I mean, if you look at it, I don't think any kid out there seeing that probably believes that's represents reality. So I'm not sure whether the public health message of something like that is getting through as credible to kids, first of all. And secondly, I think it adds to the stigmatization of meth users quite destructively, and probably gets in the way of us having a serious conversation about what the effects of meth are.
Well,
does that make sense?
It does make sense. And just for people listening here, they'd be going, okay, well, what's coming on across here? Conor's a sympathiser for the drugs and all that. But we're going to get into the discussion about the way to fight drugs, harm reduction, stop demand, all the different aspects of preventing drugs. But when you hear that, people might go, oh, well, we're meant to shock people. But if it's not working, sometimes you've got to think outside the square and change the approach. So I want to get into that in detail, possible solutions for reducing the harm that these drugs cause. And there's so many layers to it, and that's what's come across. I've just, as I said, Meth Road, the book, has opened my eyes to different approaches on fighting the drug trade. Let's take you to Myanmar first. So let's just get you across there. So you've gone across. you're trying to find a lab. You want to see the large scale lab in the jungles in Myanmar. Describe your journey there and how you managed to end up heading in that direction.
So once I realized this story was kind of out there, I decided to kind of go. And as I said, I'm a kind of boots on the ground kind of guy. Um, I was writing a book rather than making a documentary, which was great because like when you're making a documentary, you've never got any time. So when you turn up somewhere, you can either do something the patient way or the expensive way, I always think. And with documentaries, you tend to do it the expensive way and offer someone some money to show you inside a meth lab would be the way that you'd go with a documentary, which is always probably a bit dicey. It's like, well, I'm giving these criminals, 25 grand to show me what they're doing. Where am I ethically with that? So this was nice because I was writing a book, so I knew I had time. So yeah, I crossed over the border with all the tourists. I walked my way into a town called Tasha Lake, from the Thai side of the border. And I, put myself around as a guy that wanted to score some drugs initially. And it never takes long in a place, especially a place that's awash with drugs and casinos and prostitutes and all the things that Tash Lake is. It doesn't take long to find someone who wants to offer you some drugs, which I did. And then having found someone who was prepared to sell me drugs, I just had to kind of hang around long enough to win his trust until, he introduced me to someone else, and then I win their trust and they introduced me to someone else. And there was an awful lot of time. I kind of making it sound easy, but it wasn't. There was an awful lot of time put in to try and get myself to a place where I guess people started to accept me as part of the furniture. Like, oh, that guy's still here. Yeah, he hasn't gone. All the other tourists have gone home now, and he's still around.
Yeah, you get noticed, but you're part of the furniture there.
Yeah, exactly. You become part of the furniture, and then people start, asking if you want to hang out in this place, and you meet someone else. But every time I asked the question of whether I could, what I really wanted to do was meet the people that were cooking the meth. It wasn't like anyone was saying, "Oh yeah, great, we'll take you to a meth lab in the jungle." That was not a simple thing to get to. The way I found organized crime actually in Southeast Asia very different to Latin America. There's none of the machismo, there's none of the guns, there aren't people kind of getting shot left, right, and center. Instead, it's all very hush hush. Everything's being kept kind of quiet. People are operating with almost like quite organized, civilized business links with each other. I do this part of the process, you do that part of the process. None of us talk about it to anybody. We're all happy. We're all getting rich.
That's interesting.
It sort of it had that kind of feeling to it, and I felt as though people were very incentivized just to keep the money machines turning over, and being a Western journalist and turning up and asking questions was perceived by a lot of people, rightly so, suspiciously, because what am I going to do? I'm going to shine a light on something that people don't want to talk about. But there are enough people there who realize, well, this isn't a massive secret. The UN, the UNODC, the Australian Federal Police, are generating reports on this place all the time. It's, Myanmar is producing an awful lot of methamphetamine. That's known. And I think when people appreciated that what I wanted, my interest was I was just genuinely interested in the mechanics, like, how are you cooking meth? What does the meth lab look like? How is it? Where are you getting the equipment from? Where are the chemicals coming from? Like, I'm not here to trick anyone. I'm not here to get anyone in trouble with the police. I'm not going to dob anyone in. I'm not going to film anyone or take a picture of anyone's faces or use anyone's real names. I just am here because I'm genuinely interested in this process and how it works. Then I think people just started to relax a little bit, started to kind of talk to me a bit more openly and introduce me to the people that I needed to meet. And, slowly things just began to fall into place.
When did you decide it was necessary to present yourself then as someone to further up the chain, let's call it the chain of connections that you're making, to put yourself up as someone that wanted looking to import drugs into Australia? When did you decide to go under that cover?
So that's when I went over to Laos. I'd already kind of established where the meth labs were operating within Myanmar, and I'd spent some time in a sort of casino town called King's Romans, which sort of blew my mind.
Tell us about King's Roman, because it blew my mind the way it was described.
I mean, how does it exist?
Yeah.
And it's not the only one. There's like 3 or 4 of them in this region now. That sort of, so about 100 square kilometers of Lao territory that's just been leased to this Chinese billionaire who's made all of his money out of prostitutes and gambling and drugs, who's on, the US most wanted list, but they've given him his own little private kingdom. Here you go. Here's 100 square kilometers of land. He's built a massive casino, tower blocks. He's got his own police force. He's got his own, fire brigade. It's completely self-governing, and it's operating as a staging post for, a big proportion of the methamphetamine that's coming out of Myanmar on its way to Australia, and no one's talking about it. This is a place where it's like Sodom and Gomorrah when you go there. It's just full of Chinese tourists mostly young men who aren't allowed. There aren't big casino towns in China because gambling's illegal, drugs are illegal. All these, the Chinese come down pretty heavily on you if you were trying to do any of those things in China. But in this place, it's all right. Child prostitution openly on the streets,
yeah,
gambling in casinos, and there was a photographer friend of mine there, and he and I were quite interested, and we'd heard you could buy tiger meat in the restaurants. Tigers, yeah, obviously endangered. And every time we asked for it, because we were Westerners, they're like, no, you can't buy it. There's no tigers here. There's no tigers here. And then someone said to us, oh, there's some tigers over there. And we went over and found a bunch of migrant workers playing football in the park. And they were like, oh, yeah, behind those bushes there. And we went behind the bushes, and there were 12 tigers in cages waiting to be served up in the local restaurant. My mate was taking pictures of them, and one of the tigers' big paw came out from the cage, and grabbed a hold of him. Yeah, it's another story, but he ended up in hospital having a couple of tetanus. But yeah, you've got this place, King's Romans, where people are eating tigers and getting involved in all of these terrible and nefarious activities, and nobody's talking about it.
How were you received there?
Oh, with suspicion. Like, people were looking at me like, what are you doing here? There weren't many non-Asian people walking around in King's Romans. I met a couple of Ukrainian women who were working in one of the online casinos, on the phones.
Yeah.
They were about the only people I met there who had any sort of Western sensibility at all, and they were as confused as to why I was there as I was as to why they were there, which is why we managed to have a brief conversation. But yeah, it's now. I mean, King's Romans is now building an airport so that Chinese tourists can fly, directly in there without having to go through Thailand, and no one's talking about this place. It just baffles me. And like I said, it's not the only one. There's another one, Mongla, further up the river, and I was interested in how King's Romans fit into the meth road, if you like. So how did the drugs get from Myanmar to King's Romans, and how did they then get from King's Romans to the ports in Thailand and Malaysia, from where they get exported to Australia?
Yeah.
And it's when I got there, I got a bit stuck because no one along that part of the chain wanted to talk to me as a friendly guy. And I was, I didn't really have time to hang out in northern Laos for another couple of months. So that's when I hit on the idea of just posing as a buyer, just saying, look, I've got $250,000 to spend. I want to buy X kilos of methamphetamine. I've found a lab in Myanmar that can produce them. Can you help me get them out of Myanmar and to the port in Thailand? And posing as that character seemed to work quite well, because I was taken seriously quite quickly, because people just see the dollar signs and they're like, oh, this guy's got some money. And that's when a couple of smugglers came over the Friendship Bridge that they've built between Myanmar and Laos, to make friends with me and to offer their services. And then they started to explain to me how the smuggling links then worked from Myanmar as far as King's Romans, and then from King's Romans on to Bangkok. And then once you got to Bangkok, then you get into a whole new challenge. Like, how do you get it then from Bangkok into Australia?
So you got from when you met those people that came across from Myanmar on the Friendship Bridge, they took you across there to get to the meth lab?
No, so I'd already found the meth lab independently. But the people who were cooking in the meth lab, they're not involved in distribution beyond Myanmar.
Right.
So that's kind of what I was saying, is like there's this, it's quite a sophisticated network where I felt like, one group of people do their part of the job, and then another group take over doing their part of the job. And because, Myanmar is broken up into these ethnic armed groups who control their own patch of land, you might be in Wa State, or you might be in Kokang and they're cooking meth in their bit, or there might be a Chinese triad gang who are cooking in their area and they're giving them protection. And then another gang will take over and they'll do the distribution out of that region across the border into Thailand or across the border into Laos. And then you're into a different ethnic area. And so a different group of ethnic people who know those hills, know those mountains, will take over the distribution of your meth from there to the next place, and then the next place. Right. And then once you're at Bangkok, well, then those people are no use to you anymore. Then you've got to get a ton of meth from Bangkok to Australia, and then that's generally where you start getting into established commercial trade routes. You want to hide it in chili sauce, or you want to hide it in speakers or cars or something else that's coming over there in containers.
Yeah, what we hear about when the arrest is made over here in Australia. So at one point in time, they had you blindfolded in the back of a car, being taken to a location, had your phone taken off you. You had your great cover story, but I could see a couple of potential holes in it, working in that environment. How'd you feel in those situations? Because you really were rolling the dice there.
They always put a bag over your head. They always think, I'm driving through the jungle. Do you really think I'm going to remember one dirt road from another?
Yeah.
They take your phone off you.
I haven't thought of that. Yeah.
They always take your phone off you as well, I guess, because you do have GPS, and that's one thing that concerns them. That there will be a GPS marker that shows where you were. But yeah, no, I was with the guy at that point who was Michael, who'd been my translator and been my sort of link into a lot of these new relationships and gangs. We'd built up quite a friendship, Michael and I. So I trusted Michael, and I think he trusted me. He was nervous. I could tell he was nervous. He had a young family, and I wonder if he was starting to wonder why he'd gotten himself into this. But I think at that point it had become, I'd become like a dog at a bone. I wanted to see an operational meth lab, and I just wasn't going to leave until I could. And we tried several times. A couple of times I got very close to getting into a meth lab, and it wasn't actually the criminals, the people cooking who were the obstacle. It was the police, the secret police.
Yeah. Like
a couple of times I got so close, and then it was the secret police turned up. Like, they're following me. I can't shake them off because they've spotted that there's a Westerner somewhere where there shouldn't be a Westerner. And now they're following me around. And so the guys are like, well, until you lose your secret police mates, we're not going to show you where the meth lab is. Yeah. So it finally actually got to a place where I wasn't being followed, and where someone was prepared to kind of show me. As it turned out, I wasn't allowed to go into the lab. I was allowed to go into the jungle to an area close to where the lab was. Michael was allowed to go into the lab, and he was allowed to film within the lab, and he was allowed to show me the video of the lab. So I took that as kind of as close as I was going to get.
Yeah.
And having really tried, I mean, this is months and months and months and months of trying. I just had to accept, well, this is good enough for me. So he disappeared off. He came back absolutely terrified. I think he thought they were going to execute him. he showed me the video, and I could see absolutely everything from the video, to answer all the questions that I'd had. How sophisticated it was, the operational level, the number of people involved, all of those sort of details that I've been asking questions about for months. Suddenly I could kind of see for myself.
And the scale of it?
Yeah, so they were knocking out runs of 10, 20, 30 kilos at a time. They're probably able to produce like 100 kilos in a week. So very quickly get up to a ton. I kind of expected it to be, maybe a group of guys standing over a pot, stirring it with a stick. In the jungle. I mean, it was in the jungle, but that was the only thing that was rudimentary about it. It was state of the art, brand new industrial equipment, which I guess makes sense because China's just over the border, and that's where all of that industrial equipment is being produced, right?
Yep.
So they're bringing it over the Chinese border, which is not a porous border. Let's be honest. So whoever's letting that equipment come over knows exactly why it's coming over. But yeah, you're talking about like big chrome cylinders, loads of generators. All of this meth is being cooked, in sealed units under pressure. We're talking about industrial size sacks of precursors, that are being brought in off the back of, big 20-ton lorries. A considerable operation. Employing, 20 or 30 people. And those people are on annual contracts, so they're brought into the jungle. You're not allowed to go home. You're not allowed to leave. You're not allowed to speak to anyone.
People know it's happening, and as you said, like the borders are not porous, so people are aware it's going on, and it's being condoned at some level by some group. That
I mean, people who say, "Oh, well, the border's very porous and things can get through." I don't believe that. I don't believe the Chinese border is very porous. I don't think there's large numbers of migrants or drugs or guns or anything else finding their way in and out of China without the Chinese Communist Party knowing about it.
You said round there, like the secret police following you too. Like people know what's going on.
People know what's going on. But I think, the secret police can only follow you so far. Once you cross one of the battle lines, once you're into, if you leave the area that's controlled by the government is the army in Myanmar. It's the same thing. But once you leave one of the controlled areas and you're into one of the ethnic armed groups areas, you're into Wa state, for example, the secret police can't go that far. Then you're into that area is completely controlled by the Wa army.
Yeah.
But then you have to say, well, there's no way someone's cooking tons of meth here unless the Wa army know about it, because we're in their territory. So whoever's territory you're in, the people that are running that territory definitely know what's going on. It would be impossible for it to operate any other way.
Makes sense. You raised the name Michael, and I just want to raise this because I read it and checked myself when I read it, and his father, and jump in if I'm misrepresenting the story. His father was involved in a situation where the army and the rebels, and the army got hold of Michael's father, and he had to identify where the rebel stronghold was or where the rebels were based through various interrogation techniques. And Michael said they ate my father.
Yeah, they ate him. I thought he'd mistranslated.
Yeah,
I thought I'd misunderstood and he'd mistranslated. This is pretty gruesome. No one's listening to this over their breakfast, but his father was the head man in the village. The rebels came into the village and demanded that they be hidden. He hid them. Then the army came in and tortured him, and he had to give up their position. And so the rebels that managed to escape came back. They were pretty angry at him, and they took him into the jungle and tied him to a tree. And then Michael said they cut out part of his heart while he was tied to a tree, and they ate it in front of him, as to send a message to other headmen in the village that there was only one side that they better be on. Yeah. It's a brutal civil war that's going on out there when people are, doing things like that. And a young Michael, I don't know. I don't know how you kind of grow up knowing something like that.
Yeah,
what that does to you, what that does to a kid.
I mention that because when you're describing an area, and if that type of violence can be inflicted, this is a world that the majority of us, thankfully, are not aware of and don't know. You survived. Survived your Myanmar adventure, and then you came back to Australia, and then you COVID hit at some stage. It was around the COVID time. You got it was dragged out for a period of time.
Yeah, COVID was really inconvenient. Without wanting to make it all about me and my book.
Yeah. Oh, we're sorry you're put out.
No, not at all. I mean, it was yeah, COVID fell right when I was about to come back to Australia. I was in the middle of writing the book, and I wondered whether COVID would just kill off the meth trade between Myanmar and Australia, whether it just wouldn't be possible because countries borders were closing, places were locking down pretty tightly. But Australia has this great wastewater analysis that you guys do, looking at your sewage and seeing how many drugs are in it.
I'm still confused by that, but they announced that during COVID. But finding out how many drug users we've got.
Yeah, so the amount of methamphetamine being consumed in Australia annually stayed pretty level, around 10 tons. It dropped down to 9, I think, at one point when lockdowns were really serious, but it bounced back to 11 again afterwards. There's a level of methamphetamine use in Australia that will, like life, it will find a way.
Yeah. Which
meant that it was still coming in. I think maybe initially there were stockpiles that were getting run down. But eventually, I think that they found ways of coming in because trade continued, right? So the container ships were still coming in, the smuggling routes were still open. It might have been harder to get it across state lines, but it was definitely still coming into Sydney and still coming into Melbourne and still coming into Perth and the distributors were finding a way of getting it out from there. Yeah. So COVID may have slowed things down a little bit, but it definitely didn't stop things.
Okay. We might take a break here at the end of part 1 on this, and when we come back, you've got some really interesting thoughts on the way that we can deal with the drug problem over here. I want to dissect that, how we go about policing here, how harm minimisation, all sorts of things that I think are really worthwhile to at least have a discussion about, and we might do that when we get back for part 2.